cultivators. Zin's father had always warned him to never get involved with cultivators, that they brought nothing but trouble to decent common folk. But of course he'd said much the same thing about rat folk, dog folk, merchants, and any man or woman who looked like any part of their ancestry could be traced to the far south. So Zin had never put much stock in the old man's words. And after a pair of cultivators had heroically jumped in to save his town, he thought to put even less. Sure, the tiger girl was a little prickly, and the armoured hidden master a little odd, but that was supposedly par for the course for cultivators. Compared to being ripped apart by a horde of angry animals, a little bowing and scraping was a small price to pay. Really, it was little different from dealing with the Empire's tax collectors. Or so he had thought. Now, though, I can't help but wonder if the old bastard was onto something, he admitted, within the privacy of his own mind. He was guiding Master Johansson down the old path towards the mine just outside of town. Or is he Mayor Johansson now? Or am I still the mayor and he's something else? Military governor, perhaps? That's what they have in the cities, right? With the sects? He didn't know, and he dared not ask. Just down this road? Master Johansson asked. The armored man was utterly at ease as they walked past the dense forest that surrounded Jiangxi. Zim wished he could say the same. Instead, the events of the last 2 weeks had turned the once relaxing and familiar forestry around them into a source of nightmares and paranoia for the people of Jiangxi. Zin was no exception, because despite what many chose to believe upon seeing him, he was not a particularly brave man. He may have been born with the body of a half-ox, but as his wife always liked to say, he had the soul of a bureaucrat, which he liked to think was a compliment on her part, an acknowledgement of his careful and considerate nature. Probably. Yes, Master Johansson, he said warily. Fortunately for Zin's peace of mind, the armored man failed to chastise him for calling him by the wrong title, so hopefully he hadn't made a mistake on that front, though even as he had that thought, the half-orc sighed internally. This whole thing was supposed to have been simple. They'd had a predator problem, the cultivator was supposed to fix it. Hell, he had even considered himself lucky at the time. After all, it wasn't often that a cultivator passed through Jiangxi. To hear it told, the last time such a thing had occurred was in his grandfather's time, collecting levies to deal with a clash between sects. So if we want to show up at the inn just as they were having trouble with some unknown beast, well, it had seemed at the time like the heavens were shining upon him and the rest of the village. Oh, how wrong they were. This is the mine, he said somewhat innately, as they entered the clearing that contained the mine's entrance. It was not a particularly picturesque sight. Discarded tools lay strewn about from where the miners had been forced to flee the animal attack. Near the entrance lay an overturned ore container, and to add insult to injury, what appeared to be the biggest shit he'd ever seen stood dead center of it all. I suppose we have the wolf to thank for that, he thought wryly, marking his territory or some such. Still, for all the carnage strewn about, Sim would admit that it was odd to see the place empty, and it would remain so for the next few days while the townsfolk of Jiangxi focused instead on repairing the walls and butchering the meat of their attackers. After all, the mine could wait, but the meat and fur would spoil unless it was taken care of promptly. Make hay while the sun shines and all that. All right, the cultivator said, jolting Zim from his melancholy. Thanks for guiding me here. You can leave. The dismissal was as obvious as it was offhanded. Not that Zim was about to complain. The less time he spent in the cultivator's presence, the better it would be for his already frayed nerves. Which is why he could only pray that the other one wasn't still gorging herself in the inn's dining hall when he returned. How any one person could eat as much as the half-tiger woman did, he had no idea. Jack grinned as he surveyed the mine. It had worked. They bought it. As far as anyone was concerned, he was one of these hidden masters. What exactly that meant, he still wasn't entirely sure, but he liked to think he had the broad strokes down. Best as he could tell, they were punch wizards who lived in seclusion in the name of punching better, as opposed to the more normal type of punch wizard who tended to live in a compound full of other punch wizards and their mortal servants. Also, punch wizardry was a thing. Proper martial arts shit. Ki and heavenly energy and meridians and all that crap. Which was certainly better than Cthulhu World, but still not ideal. Because to hear that tiger lass talk about it all, there were people in this world that could shatter mountains with a punch, and fling lightning around like it was going out of style. And one of those scary bastards lived in a city not 9 days from here, along with entire sects of people with similar, if lesser abilities. which meant his Hev was not the invincible bastion against the troubles of the world he'd hoped it was. Though to be fair, he'd kind of already suspected that after clashing with that wolf of unusual size. Still, despite all that, he was still a relatively big fish, even if there were plenty of much bigger fish hanging around, ones that could apparently snap him up without even breaking stride, or stroke. Paddle? The Scandinavian man shook his head. His point was, he'd apparently have to be careful in his execution of what he was tentatively starting to call the plan. What was the plan? Simple. Power, money, and women. If he was going to be stuck on this world, he was going to make it as livable for himself as possible. A little self-serving, perhaps, but he never claimed to be a deep thinker, or a philanthropist, or particularly good at long-term planning. He wouldn't have ended up in the Canary Mining Corps if he was. No, the Canaries tended to attract people whose ambitions, or debts, outstripped their desire for personal safety, because it took a certain level of opportunism or desperation to sign up for a tourist service mining on a world that was actively in the process of collapsing, as a result of said mining. Jan liked to think of himself as being predominantly in possession of the former trait, even if he would fully admit that the latter was far more likely what was stamped on his personal file. After all, it also took a certain amount of blind ambition to start planning out the creation of your own personal kingdom, in a world full of magical fist wizards and dragons, when all you had to your name was a second-generation mining rig and a fairly spotty understanding of the technology you were planning on introducing to the local populace. Because he would fully admit that he had less than zero idea of how one actually went about making a musket, or even a halfway decent cannon. He was a miner, not a soldier, and he knew for a fact that the strictly civilian-oriented database loaded into his suit wouldn't have the blueprints for either. Which was why the first thing he needed was a base of operations while he found his feet, and Jiangxi fit the bill quite nicely. Rich metal veins, a pliable populace, and it was just isolated enough for him to get set up before news of his actions reached anyone who might prove a problem for him. So, let's get started, he thought, eyeing the nearby ore stockpile as he fired up the nanoforge in his back. With any luck, I can get my first mining drone built before night rolls around. As such, it was with a song in his heart and a jump in his step that he started pillaging the natural resources of the land in the old and prestigious name of personal gain. Hi-ho, here's off to work we go. The mine is sealed. Zin blinked sleepily as he looked up from his wife's bowl of congee. One advantage of being mayor was that he was not compelled to rise with the sun like most of the village was. An indulgence perhaps, but one he allowed himself. So he was still rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he stared blearily at the man that strode into his kitchen. What do you mean, sealed? Sealed? The man, who Zin now realized was clad in a miner's overalls, reiterated. As in, it's got a great big fuck-off metal barrier across the front. Zin felt a headache forming as he looked back down into his rice porridge. It seemed he'd been lulled into a false state of security over the last 3 days. For all his talk of owning the town, the cultivator had spent surprisingly little time in it. Oh, he had returned on that first day for an hour to grab something to eat from the inn, but since then no one had seen hide nor hair of him. Some of the more outspoken, or perhaps just duller, members of the community had suggested that the powerful cultivator had simply wandered off, leaving the prickly tiger woman behind in the process. Which Zin could admit would not have been too out of character for the mercurial beings that were cultivators, at least according to what stories managed to percolate out to their little village. Stories that his own recent encounters with cultivators had proven to be in no way inaccurate. One of them was as prickly as a hedgehog, while the other was as unpredictable as a squirrel at night. Either way, with the mine being the man's last known location, and most of the populace otherwise occupied, the people of Jiangxi had been content to simply steer clear of the place, because, as grateful for his and the Tiger Woman's actions as they might have been, rare was the mortal that stood comfortably in the presence of cultivators. Unfortunately, the window of time in which they could reasonably afford to avoid the town's main source of income had come to an end today. With the walls all fixed to the best of their ability and the animals butchered and ready for storage, it was time for the miners to return to their real vocation. Only it seemed that their resident lightning-throwing cultivator had not vacated the premises in the intervening 3 days, like most of the village had been hoping. Zin sighed, idly running a hand across one of his horns. All right, let me get my shoes on and I'll meet you down there. With any luck, this wouldn't prove too difficult to resolve. The scene he arrived at as he strode down the path to the mine was about what he expected. Almost all of the village's miners were milling around the clearing, occasionally throwing glances towards the mine entrance or the path back to town. They were a group of big, burly men, time below ground, lending well to a stout, if slightly pale, physique. And yet, they looked like a group of children waiting for their parents to arrive, to resolve some issue or other as they waited for him. Not that he blamed them. He'd probably be content to wait too if it meant someone else would arrive to deal with the crazy shenanigans of a cultivator. Alas, that wasn't an option for him. "Alright, get out of the way, you louts," he called out to the group surrounding the entrance of the mine. "Let me get in there and see what we're dealing with." Obligingly, if not without some muttered grumbles, the group of men shuffled aside to let him past, which gave him a full view of exactly what they'd all been staring at. A metal wall. It covered the entirety of the entrance to the mine, bizarrely devoid of any of the ripples from the forge. The only features in the otherwise blank wall was a bizarre square grille off to the right-hand side that held a small glass circle with a circular symbol below. What strange cultivator magic is this? He thought. It speaks. It what? Zin asked as he turned to the familiar rotund form of Foreman Zhen. It speaks. It what? Zin asked as he turned to the familiar rotund form of Foreman Zhen. It speaks. The man spoke with his typical laconic drawl, seemingly unperturbed by the absurdity he was spouting. When one of the boys approached, the voice of the cultivator issued forth from it. What did it say? Zhen shrugged. Just that it wanted to speak with the mayor, to get this whole thing sorted out. Zin's frown only deepened. Had the cultivator sealed himself inside the mine? He'd heard stories about them doing things like that, like bears hibernating for winter, only with meditation instead of slumber. He certainly hoped that wasn't the case, because that would be a problem. As if the giant metal wall he's somehow erected in less than 3 days isn't already a problem, he thought. So I just go up and talk to it? He asked. One of the miners present stepped forward, a younger lad. The voice said to press the circle under the grill to get the master cultivator's attention. Zin nodded, turning towards the metal wall. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward with what he hoped appeared to be confident steps. It was important for a leader to appear confident, after all, even if his state as the de facto leader of Jiangxi had been put in doubt in recent days. Still, the fact that the cultivator had referred to him as the mayor, at least, somewhat suggested that his role hadn't been entirely usurped. He pressed the button and waited. 5 seconds became 10. 10 became 20. 20 became a minute. By the 3-minute mark, Zin was beginning to feel at a loss as to what to do. Did he press it again? He didn't particularly want to do that, but he was also all too aware of the expectant gazes of his people behind him. Fortunately, a voice rang out from the wall just as he began to raise his hand. Apologies for the wait. The voice of Master Johansson gave much face by saying those words to him, and for just a moment Zin felt this might all be resolved amicably. I was just working on something in the back. Still, I'm glad to see you've come down to see me, Mayor Zin. He felt a little ridiculous as he bowed to the door, but he figured it was best to err on the side of caution. Oh, great cultivator, you called, and this lowly servant has answered. Yeah, Master Johansson drawled after a slightly uncomfortable pause. Thanks for that. But, you see, here's the thing. I kind of called you down here to tell you that your boys are going to need to clear out for now. I'm doing stuff with the mine. Jim paled. It was as he'd feared. The mine was the lifeblood of the town, though. Much of their tax was taken in pure ore. It couldn't be closed. He bowed deeper. Please forgive this lowly servant's impertinence, my lord, but the miners need to work. The trade of iron and other metals are integral to the function of our home. From behind him, he could already hear the beginnings of resentful muttering, because unlike the cultivator's proclamation that he would conquer Jiangxi, his latest actions could not be dismissed as boastful gloating. After all, cultivators were known to be boastful and prone to making outrageous claims, or at least that was the narrative Zin had spent the last 3 days pushing, lest one of the village's more hot-headed residents do something foolish. He couldn't downplay this, though. The sealing of the mine and obstruction of work was not a harmless boast. It was a direct threat to the livelihood of the men present, and they would not let it be threatened without complaint, which is why he needed to speak fast, lest the force to his rear rouse the insane man to his thought of violence. If they are unable to work, the families of the men behind me will go hungry. Which is both true and untrue. Sure, as mayor, he'd feed them in the short term. A town like theirs didn't survive without people pulling together. It was why everyone had pitched in to help with the butchering of the animal meat, but it became clear that Lynn the butcher could not handle it all himself. So they had a surplus of food, of which the miners could rightly claim some. From there was still work to go around. A number of people had been injured during the attack and were still recuperating. The outlying farms could use the extra hands the miners would provide. That wouldn't last forever, though. The village of Jiangxi could only soak up so much extra manpower. In a town like theirs could ill afford mouths that did not work, especially not when Guoan had claimed that more attacks, like the one that had nearly destroyed their town, were all but guaranteed. That last fact weighed on his mind, and was only part of the reason why he wasn't too resentful of the insanely powerful cultivator's claims to ownership of the town. Or at least he hadn't been, until now, because the loss of the mine would kill the town as surely as any beast attack, if only more slowly. Damn, that quickly? The cultivator's peculiar accent echoed through the walls. I would have thought you could all find yourself something to keep you occupied for a little while, at least for a few days, farming or some shit. Never thought you'd all be living paycheck to paycheck. Oh, was that good? He had no idea what a paycheck was, but the man's words seemed to imply that he was aware of the importance of a mortal's daily toil. Had he underestimated the man? Before he could say anything else, the Master Johansson continued. Alright, I guess I'll have to rush my plans forward a bit. His voice suddenly increased in volume, carrying to the nervous crowd of miners behind Zin. Listen up, lads. I'll need to borrow your mind for the foreseeable future, but don't worry. I won't be robbing you of your livelihoods without leaving you any recourse. There'll be jobs in the future. Paying jobs. Zin nodded slowly. Yes, that was good. Though he wondered what those jobs were. Did the man need servants? He didn't know how well the men would respond to that. They were miners, frontiermen, not dainty city folk accustomed to bowing and scraping to every pale-faced cultivator or noble that crossed their path. Sure, their town had been cowed by Master Johansson's recent show of power, but Zin didn't know how long that would last. Eventually someone would slip up. Alright, you lot should return here tomorrow. I should be ready for you then. Zin bowed, because he couldn't help but feel that the other man could see him, despite the wall between them. I was about to turn to leave, when the Master Johansson's voice called out to him once more. Oh, by the by, do you have any soldiers in your village, current or former? Soldiers? Zin paused. His grandfather had once been called up to serve in the levy, along with a few other youths at the time, but none had since. Nor did they have any full-time guards like they had in the city. Nay, Master Cultivator, he admitted. Drat. I suppose I had to put Guao on that. As if summoned by his words, and for all he knew she was, Zin heard a murmuring behind them. Guao walked imperiously through the crowd, no doubt fresh from her 3 times daily depleting of the inn's larders. Oh, good, Master Johansson said. There she is. Tell her to come in on your way out. Zin nodded, hastily stepping away from the wall. Mistress Cultivator, Master Johansson has requested... I heard, the woman said simply, stepping past him without breaking stride. Then, to both his and the collected crowd's astonishment, the wall opened down the middle. Sliding to each side, the doors revealed an interior that most assuredly was not that of the mineshaft that had been there 3 days previously. Instead, he got a glimpse of a brightly lit hall with smooth stone walls and floor. Then the doors shut once more, and returned to appearing for all the world like a single impenetrable slab of iron. Xin could only shake his head at the cultivator's ridiculousness, though now that he looked closer, he realized he could see a tiny seam between the 2 slabs of the sliding doors. Silence reigned in the clearing. So, do we just leave? Zin turned to see Foreman Zhen, standing at the front of the crowd, seemingly disaffected by the absurdity they had just witnessed. Still, Zin latched onto the small oasis of reasonableness. It seems we have little choice in the matter. For the foreseeable future, it seems that Master Johansson has laid claim to the mine for his own ends. Zhen stared at the doorway, a small, almost imperceptible frown tugging at his lips. Then he spat on the floor, which was about as close as Zin had ever seen the unflappable man get to throwing a temper tantrum. Master Johansson has promised jobs as recompense for occupying the mine, Zin said, commiseratingly. What kind, though? Another man asked, glancing between Zin and the doors. I'm a miner, my daddy was a miner, his daddy was a miner, it's all we know. Around him, other men echoed their agreement. Zheng could only shrug. Given his question about soldiers, I imagine it will be guard-related. The crowd seemed, if nothing else, slightly mollified by that, which Zheng could understand. Sure, they were unhappy about the loss of their primary vocation, But they all had family back in the village too, and the need for more protection was clear to all. Hell, almost all of those present had been involved in the defense of their home not 3 days back. Seizing on their thoughts, Zing continued, subtly cajoling the crowd to get moving back toward town. This move by the cultivator is likely just a passing fancy on his part. I'm sure he will get bored of hanging around us mortals soon enough and return home. Until then, we need only reap the benefits of his protection. Once he is gone, the mine will be returned to us, and all will be as it was. Of course, Zhen, the taciturn bastard that he was, had to poke holes in his perfectly palatable narrative. That's assuming he takes down those doors of his before he leaves, because I've got no idea how we go about pulling them down if the need arose. Dig around it, perhaps, one of the younger men suggested. Another piped up. How'd you even think he made it anyway? Well, he sure as shit didn't use Fat Gren's forge, a third pitched in. I heard cultivators can bend the earth to do their bidding. Zing could only relax as the conversation turned to far more esoteric topics, because so long as they were talking about that, it meant no one was raising the possibility or trying to force the cultivator to do, well, anything. Which meant that, for now at least, they continued to avoid disaster. I'm also mildly curious as to Master Johansson's plans for this guard force of his. As tired and cynical a soul as he was, he could admit that some small, quiet part of his imagination flared at the thought of receiving training from an actual cultivator. Glancing around his compatriots as they continued the walk back to the village, he couldn't help but wonder if he wasn't the only one. It would certainly go some way to explain the ease with which the miners around him had accepted the loss of their main source of income. Well, that and an innate desire not to be vaporized by an offended cultivator.